I gave my daughter Sarah everything I had for 45 years. I worked 2 jobs to put her through private school, sold my jewelry to pay for her college, and even took out a second mortgage to help her buy her first home. But the day she told me I was too much of a burden and needed to go to a nursing home, I realized I had raised a stranger. What she didn't know was that I had already planned 3 steps ahead. By the time she figured out what I'd done, it was too late to undo the papers she'd signed so eagerly. Let me start from the beginning because this story really begins 45 years ago when Sarah was born. I was 28 then married to Robert, working as a secretary at an insurance company. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. Robert worked construction steady work that paid decent wages, and we'd saved enough to buy a small house on Maple Street. It wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a tiny kitchen, but it was ours. When Sarah came along, everything changed. Not just in the way all new parents say everything changes, but literally everything. She was born 6 weeks premature with underdeveloped lungs and a weak heart. The doctors weren't sure she'd make it through her first month. I quit my job to stay home with her, monitoring every breath, every heartbeat, sleeping in shifts so someone was always watching her. Those first 2 years were a blur of medical appointments, specialists and hospital stays. Our insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough. We burned through our savings, then started borrowing. I went back to work part-time when Sarah was stable enough, but I also picked up a second job cleaning offices at night. Robert took overtime whenever he could get it, sometimes working 6 days a week. By the time Sarah was healthy and stable, we were drowning in debt. But we didn't care. Our little girl was alive and thriving, and that was all that mattered. We'd figure out the money somehow. The somehow turned out to be 15 years of scrimping and saving and working ourselves to the bone. I never bought new clothes unless something wore out completely. We ate a lot of beans and rice, and our idea of a vacation was a day trip to the lake. But Sarah never went without. She had new school clothes every fall, a birthday party every year, Christmas mornings full of presents. If there was something she needed or even really wanted, we found a way to make it happen. When she was in middle school, Sarah developed a passion for dance. Not just any dance, but ballet. And not just any ballet classes, but the best ones in the city. The tuition was more than our mortgage payment. But when I saw how her face lit up when she talked about it, I knew we'd make it work somehow. That somehow was me taking a 3rd job working weekends at a department store. I was exhausted all the time surviving on coffee and determination, but watching Sarah perform in her first recital made every sleepless night worth it. She was beautiful up there, graceful and confident in a way that took my breath away. This was what I'd worked for to give my daughter opportunities I'd never had. High school brought new challenges. Sarah wanted to go to a private preparatory academy, the kind of school that would get her into a good college. The tuition was astronomical, more than Robert made in half a year. But Sarah had her heart set on it, and she'd gotten a partial scholarship based on her grades and dance performances. We just had to come up with the rest. That's when I sold my grandmother's ring. It was the only valuable thing I owned, a beautiful antique setting with a small but perfect diamond. My grandmother had worn it for 60 years and my mother had passed it down to me on her deathbed. I'd always planned to give it to Sarah someday. Instead, I took it to a jewelry store and sold it to pay for her first year of tuition. I never told Sarah about the ring. I never told her about a lot of the sacrifices Robert and I made. We wanted her to feel secure, to know that she was loved and valued, not to feel guilty about the cost of that love. The prep school years were tough. In addition to tuition, there were uniforms, books, field trips, and all the social pressures that come with being around wealthy kids when you're not wealthy yourself. Sarah needed to look the part to fit in, or she'd be miserable. So we made sure she had what she needed, even when it meant we ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner 3 nights a week. Robert's health started declining during Sarah's junior year. All those years of hard physical labor combined with the stress of our financial situation had taken their toll. He developed back problems that made construction work increasingly difficult, then heart problems that made any physical labor dangerous. His income dropped dramatically right when we needed it most. College was looming, and we all knew Sarah's grades and talents would get her into expensive schools. That's when I made the decision to take out a second mortgage on the house. It was risky. If anything happened to our income, we could lose everything. But Sarah had been accepted to 3 excellent colleges, and her dream school had offered her a substantial scholarship that would cover about half the costs. We just needed to bridge the gap for 4 years, and then presumably she'd graduate and get a good job, and everything would work out. College was even more expensive than we'd anticipated. There were costs the scholarship didn't cover: lab fees, technology fees, housing upgrades, study abroad programs. Every semester brought new expenses, and every semester we found a way to cover them. Robert took a desk job that paid less, but was easier on his body. I added tutoring and freelance bookkeeping to my collection of jobs. We were exhausted and stressed, but we were proud. Our daughter was getting the education we'd never had. Sarah thrived in college. She made the dean's list every semester, joined the best sororities, studied abroad in Italy, and graduated summa cum laude with a degree in business administration. We were so proud of her at graduation, watching her walk across that stage in her cap and gown, knowing that every sacrifice we'd made had been worth it. After college, Sarah got a job at a marketing firm in the city. It was a good job with growth potential, but the starting salary wasn't huge. She wanted to move out of her college apartment and into something nicer, but she couldn't afford it on her own. So Robert and I co-signed a lease for her, and when she couldn't make the security deposit, we covered that too. A year later, Sarah met Mark. He was older, established, working as an accountant at a mid-sized firm. They hit it off immediately, and within 6 months they were talking about marriage. I liked Mark well enough. He seemed stable and responsible, and he clearly adored Sarah. But there was something about the way he talked about money, about success, about building wealth that made me slightly uncomfortable. He wasn't greedy exactly, but he was very focused on financial gain in a way that felt different from how Robert and I approached life. When they got engaged, Sarah came to us with a problem. They'd found the perfect apartment, a beautiful 2-bedroom in a trendy neighborhood, but they needed help with the down payment for the mortgage. It was a lot of money, more than we had in savings. But Sarah painted such a picture of their future, how this apartment would be an investment, how they'd build equity, how it would set them up for success. And she was our daughter. How could we say no? That's when we took out the second mortgage. It was scary putting our house at risk, but Sarah promised they'd help us out once they were established. She wasn't asking for a gift. She said just a loan to get them started. We believed her. We wanted to believe her. The wedding was beautiful. Sarah insisted on having it at the country club with a professional photographer and a live band and flowers everywhere. The cost was staggering, but it was her special day, and she'd only get married once. We were already stretched thin from the apartment down payment, but we found a way to make it work. I took on additional freelance projects, working until midnight most nights for months, leading up to the wedding. Robert picked up weekend work, despite his health problems. I remember standing in that country club watching Sarah dance with Mark, and feeling such a complex mix of emotions. Pride because she looked absolutely radiant and happy. Love because she was my daughter and this was her day. But also a kind of bone-deep exhaustion, and a tiny voice in the back of my head wondering when we'd be able to stop stretching, stop scrambling, stop sacrificing. After the wedding, things should have settled down. Sarah and Mark were both working, living in their nice apartment building, their life together. But somehow there were always new expenses, new requests for help. The apartment needed furniture, not just any furniture, but the right furniture that would make the right impression. Sarah's job required a professional wardrobe, and she needed help building that. Mark's car broke down and they needed a loan for a replacement. Each request was reasonable on its own. Each one came with promises of repayment and expressions of gratitude, and each one stretched our finances a little thinner. Robert and I started talking about maybe downsizing, moving to a smaller place, but the second mortgage made that complicated. We were stuck in a house we could barely afford, taking care of expenses we couldn't really handle, all in the name of helping our daughter succeed. Then Robert got sick, really sick. What started as fatigue and shortness of breath turned into a diagnosis of congestive heart failure. The doctors said it was probably related to years of physical stress and poor diet, the kind of poor diet you eat when you're spending all your money on other people and surviving on whatever's cheapest. The last 2 years of Robert's life were hard. He couldn't work at all, so we were down to just my income, plus his small disability payments. The medical bills were crushing even with insurance. But through it all, Sarah was supportive and loving. She visited regularly, helped with doctor's appointments, and even contributed money toward his care when she could. When Robert died, I thought Sarah and I grew closer. She helped me plan the funeral, held my hand at the service, and stayed with me for a week afterward to help me adjust to being alone. I was grateful for her support during the darkest time of my life. But I also started noticing things. Little comments about how big the house was for just one person. Observations about how much work it must be to maintain. Suggestions that I might be happier in a smaller place, something more manageable. At first, I thought she was just concerned about me. The house did feel empty without Robert, and some of the maintenance was challenging to handle alone. But then the comments became more frequent and more pointed. Sarah started talking about her own housing situation, how crowded their apartment was, how they were thinking about starting a family and would need more space. She'd walk through my house and make comments about the unused bedrooms, the big backyard, how it seemed wasteful for one person to have so much space. I began to realize that Sarah wasn't worried about me being lonely in a big house. She was coveting the house itself. The hints became more direct over time. Sarah would mention houses in the neighborhood that had sold, and for what prices. She'd bring up articles about seniors who had downsized and were so much happier in retirement communities. She started talking about how hard it would be for me to maintain the house as I got older, how dangerous it might be for me to live alone. I was 77 years old, not 97. I had some arthritis and my energy wasn't what it used to be, but I was far from helpless. I could cook and clean and take care of myself just fine. I had friends in the neighborhood, a routine I enjoyed, and no desire whatsoever to leave the home I'd lived in for 30 years. But Sarah kept pushing. She'd find articles about seniors falling in their homes and ending up in the hospital. She'd mention elderly neighbors who'd had medical emergencies with no one around to help. She was building a case for why I couldn't continue living independently, and it was beginning to feel less like concern and more like manipulation. That's when I started paying closer attention to our financial relationship. Over the years, Sarah and Mark had borrowed money from Robert and me many times. They'd paid some of it back, but not all. In fact, when I sat down and really looked at the numbers, they still owed us nearly $40,000. Money we'd loaned them for various emergencies and opportunities over the years. I also started noticing that the promises to help us financially, the promises Sarah had made when she asked for help with the apartment down payment, had never materialized. They were doing well. Sarah had gotten several promotions. Mark's career was advancing. They drove nice cars and took expensive vacations. But somehow they never seemed to have extra money to help with the mortgage payments that were straining my budget. It occurred to me that Sarah might be calculating. If she could convince me to move out of the house, and if something happened to me, she'd inherit a property worth several $100,000. Money that could solve a lot of problems and fund the lifestyle she'd grown accustomed to. I started testing this theory. I'd mention financial struggles and Sarah would immediately suggest that selling the house would solve everything. I'd talk about home repairs I needed to make and she'd argue that it wasn't worth investing in an old house. Every conversation seemed to circle back to the same solution: I should sell the house and move somewhere smaller and cheaper. But here's what Sarah didn't know. Robert had been smarter with money than either of us realized at the time. During the years when we were struggling to pay for Sarah's education and help her get established, he'd made some investments that I'd barely paid attention to. He'd bought a small duplex across town as a rental property, structuring it through a limited liability company for tax purposes. The duplex was in a neighborhood that was just beginning to gentrify when Robert bought it. Over the years, as the area improved, both the property value and the rental income had increased substantially. The rental income went into a separate account that Robert had set up, and after he died, I'd just let it accumulate. I used my other income for living expenses and didn't touch the rental money. By the time Sarah started pressuring me to sell my house, that account had grown to over $850,000. Combined with the current value of the duplex, I had well over $1 million in assets that Sarah knew nothing about. I also had something else Sarah didn't know about: a keen understanding of legal documents and property law. All those years of working multiple jobs had included several years doing bookkeeping and administrative work for a law firm. I'd learned a lot about real estate transactions, estate planning, and asset protection. I wasn't the helpless old woman Sarah seemed to think I was. So when Sarah announced that she and Mark had decided I needed to go to a nursing home, I was ready for her. The morning Sarah made her announcement, I was sitting in my favorite armchair reading the newspaper. It was a Tuesday in March, unseasonably warm for the season, and I'd opened the windows to let in fresh air. I was wearing my favorite blue sweater, the one Robert had given me for our 20th anniversary, and I'd just made a fresh pot of coffee. Sarah let herself in with the key I'd given her years ago, a key I was beginning to regret providing. She was dressed in her work clothes, a sharp business suit that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in a year, and she had that look on her face that I'd learned to recognize. It was the look she got when she'd made a decision and expected everyone else to go along with it. Mark followed behind her also in work clothes, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. He'd always been the more passive one in their relationship content, to let Sarah take the lead on difficult conversations. But his presence told me this wasn't going to be a casual chat. Sarah perched on the edge of the couch like she was afraid to get too comfortable. Her voice had that tone she used when she was trying to sound reasonable and caring, while delivering news she knew I wouldn't like. She told me we needed to talk about my living situation. She and Mark had been discussing it, and they thought it would be best if I moved into a care facility. The words hung in the air between us. I'd been expecting this conversation for months, but hearing it out loud still felt like a punch to the chest. When I asked what kind of care facility, she clarified that she meant a nursing home. Sunset Manor, she said, about 20 minutes from here. They have activities, medical care, on-site people your own age to socialize with. I'd be much safer there and much happier. I told her I was happy where I was. This was my home. But Mark stepped forward, then his voice sharp with impatience, telling me Sarah was right. I was 78 years old, he said. What if I fell and no one was around to help? What if I had a medical emergency? What if I forgot to lock the doors or turn off the stove? They couldn't be worrying about me all the time. All the time I wanted to laugh. Sarah visited maybe once a week usually to ask for something, or to pressure me about the house. When was the last time either of them had checked on me daily or even regularly? I told them I managed just fine. I'd been living alone for 10 years since Robert died, and I hadn't had any emergencies or accidents. But Sarah's expression hardened, and I saw a flash of irritation cross her face. She wasn't used to being contradicted, especially not by me. She told me I was being unrealistic. This wasn't a discussion, it was what needed to happen. She'd already put down a deposit at Sunset Manor. I was moving in next week. The words hit me like cold water. Next week. She'd already made the arrangements, already paid money, already decided my fate without consulting me. My own daughter had planned to dispose of me like I was an old piece of furniture she was tired of looking at. I felt something shift inside me, a kind of cold clarity settling over my shock and hurt. I asked what would happen to my house, and Sarah and Mark exchanged a glance that confirmed my worst suspicions. They'd obviously discussed this part of the plan extensively. Sarah told me they'd need to sell it to pay for my care. Nursing homes were expensive, she said. Even with my Social Security and Robert's pension, they'd need the proceeds from the house to cover the costs. Mark pulled out a folder they'd come prepared with paperwork, I realized. Sunset Manor cost about $6,500 a month for the level of care I'd need. That was $78,000 a year. I did quick math in my head. At that rate, the proceeds from selling my house would last maybe 4 or 5 years. When I asked what happened after that, Mark shrugged and said hopefully Medicaid would kick in by then. They'd cross that bridge when they came to it. Hopefully. They'd spend my life savings and then hope the government would take care of me. How generous of them. I asked if they'd already found a buyer for the house, and Sarah had the grace to look slightly embarrassed, but she pressed on. Actually, she said Mark and I were thinking that instead of putting it on the market, maybe we could just handle the transaction privately. Transfer the deed to us and we'll take care of all the expenses. It would be simpler that way, fewer complications. There it was, the real plan. They didn't want to sell my house to pay for my care. They wanted my house, period. The nursing home was just a convenient way to get me out of it. When I asked simpler for whom Sarah's voice took on an edge. For everyone, she said. We're trying to help you here. This is a lot of responsibility and paperwork, and frankly, you're not really equipped to handle complex financial transactions anymore. Not equipped. Because I was old, I was automatically incompetent. Never mind that I'd been managing my own finances for 60 years, had successfully raised a child, run a household, and held down multiple jobs. Because I was 78, I was apparently too addled to understand a real estate transaction. I told them I needed some time to think about this, but Sarah snapped that there was nothing to think about. The decision was made. She'd already scheduled the movers for next Saturday, and she'd taken time off work to help me pack. Scheduled the movers, without asking me, without even consulting me about what I might want to take or leave behind. She'd planned my entire future like I was a piece on a chessboard. When I expressed my shock about this, Sarah's voice rose as she told me she was trying to make this as easy as possible for me. I was acting like they were the villains here, but they were the ones taking responsibility. They were the ones making sure I was taken care of. Did I have any idea how stressful this was for them? Stressful for them. My daughter was forcing me out of my home, stealing my property, and warehousing me in an institution, and I was supposed to feel sorry for her stress. I told them both to leave. I needed time to process this. Mark looked relieved. He'd clearly been uncomfortable with the whole conversation. But Sarah wasn't finished. She told me not to make this harder than it had to be. I was going to Sunset Manor next Saturday. That was final. I could either cooperate and make it pleasant, or I could fight it and make it miserable for everyone. But either way, it was happening. After they left, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and thought about the conversation. Sarah had revealed more than she'd intended. This wasn't about my safety or my well-being. This was about money and convenience. They wanted my house, and they wanted me out of the way. I could hear her excitement as she told me how glad she was that I understood. She knew this was hard, but it really was for the best. I told her I'd like to get the paperwork handled quickly. I'd spoken to my lawyer today, and he could have everything ready by Thursday. Could she and Mark come by around 2? She said of course and told me I was making the right decision. Sunset Manor was going to be wonderful. They had bingo every Tuesday and movie nights on Fridays. Bingo and movie nights. She thought that's what would make me happy. She really had no idea who I was anymore. I told her I was sure it would be lovely. After I hung up, I sat in Robert's old chair and thought about the conversation. Sarah was so pleased with herself, so confident that she'd managed me successfully. She had no idea what she was about to sign. The next 2 days passed slowly. I spent time walking through my house, looking at everything with new eyes. The living room where Sarah had taken her first steps. The kitchen where I'd packed thousands of school lunches. The master bedroom where Robert and I had spent 30 years of marriage. I wasn't really losing the house. That wasn't the point of my plan. But I was changing my relationship to it, and that felt significant. This house had been my security, my sanctuary, my proof that all the hard work and sacrifice had been worth something. Now it was going to become something else, a lesson in consequences. Thursday arrived grey and drizzly, which somehow felt appropriate. Sarah and Mark showed up exactly on time, both of them practically vibrating with excitement. Sarah was carrying a bottle of champagne. Apparently she thought this was an occasion worth celebrating. She told me she'd brought it to toast my new beginning. This was such a positive step. Mark was looking around the house with barely concealed satisfaction, probably already planning how they'd redecorate once I was gone. He asked if I'd thought about what I wanted to take with me to Sunset Manor. The rooms were pretty small, so I'd need to be selective. Selective. I was supposed to choose a few mementos from a lifetime and leave the rest behind. How generous of them to let me keep some things. Jim arrived a few minutes later carrying his briefcase and wearing his most professional expression. He greeted everyone and said he had all the paperwork ready for the property transfer. Sarah could barely contain her excitement, telling me how wonderful this was, and thanking me for trusting them with this. I told her I trusted her completely, and I meant it. I trusted her to be exactly as selfish and short-sighted as she'd already proven herself to be. Jim spread out the documents with practiced efficiency, explaining this was a quitclaim deed transferring the property at 1247 Maple Street from Eleanor Henderson to Sarah Henderson Matthews and Mark Matthews, joint tenants, with rights of survivorship. When Mark asked what that meant exactly, Jim explained it meant they'd both own the property equally, and if something happened to one of them, the other would inherit full ownership. Sarah nodded eagerly, saying it was perfect. She asked if I understood that once I signed this, they'd be responsible for all the decisions about the property. I told her I understood completely, and I did. I signed my name with a flourish, thinking of Robert and how proud he'd be that I was finally standing up for myself. Sarah and Mark signed next Mark's hand, actually trembling slightly with excitement. Jim notarized all the signatures and congratulated Sarah and Mark, telling them they were now the proud owners of 1247 Maple Street. Sarah actually clapped her hands together, telling me how exciting this was, and thanking me so much for making this easy for them. I told her I did try to make things easy. Mark rubbed his hands together like he was about to eat a good meal, and said they should probably discuss the timeline for getting me moved to Sunset Manor. He knew they were expecting me this weekend. But then Jim interrupted, pulling out another folder and saying there were a few more documents we needed to review first. Sarah frowned, asking about more documents, and Jim said yes, there were some existing agreements related to this property that the new owners needed to understand. He opened the folder and pulled out a thick stack of papers, explaining this was the current lease agreement for the property. Mark's voice cracked slightly as he asked about a lease agreement, and Jim nodded calmly, explaining yes, this property had been operated as a rental since 1994. Eleanor had been the tenant for the past 30 years. I watched the color drain from Sarah's face as she asked what he was talking about. This was my house, she said. I'd always lived here. Jim confirmed that yes, I'd always lived here, but the property had been owned by Henderson Holdings, LLC, since Robert purchased it and restructured the ownership for tax purposes. I'd been renting the property from the LLC under a very favorable long-term lease. Mark was frantically flipping through the papers, asking what kind of lease, and Jim explained in his professorial voice that it was a lifetime lease at $200 per month, with all utilities, taxes, insurance, and maintenance to be provided by the property owner. It was quite a good deal for the tenant, he said. Sarah was staring at me like I'd grown a second head, asking what this was and what I'd done. I told her sweetly that I'd given her exactly what she'd asked for. She'd wanted to own my house, and now she did. Congratulations. Mark was still reading frantically, discovering that I had the right to occupy the property for the remainder of my natural life, and they were responsible for all maintenance and expenses. Jim confirmed that was correct. As the new property owners, they'd be responsible for property taxes, currently about $4,000 per year homeowners insurance, which ran about $2,400 annually, all utilities which typically cost about $300 per month, and of course, any maintenance or repairs the property required. I could see Sarah doing math in her head, and I could tell she didn't like the results. She protested that I couldn't stay here if I was supposed to go to the nursing home, but I asked innocently why I would go to a nursing home. I was perfectly capable of taking care of myself, and now I had such wonderful landlords. That was her. I was sure she'd take excellent care of the property. Mark looked like he was about to be sick, asking if this could be legal. She couldn't just trap them like this. Jim assured him everything was completely legal. I'd been a model tenant for 30 years. I had every right to continue my tenancy under the terms of the lease. Sarah was almost shouting now, saying they needed to sell the house. They'd put down a deposit on Sunset Manor. They were expecting to use the money from the sale. Jim said helpfully that they could certainly try to sell the property, but any buyer would have to honor my lease agreement. A property with a lifetime tenant paying $200 per month, well, that would significantly impact the market value. Sarah was looking around wildly, like she was trapped in a nightmare, saying this was insane. There had to be a way out of this. Jim suggested they could always sell the property back to me. He was sure I'd be reasonable about the price. The room was silent, except for the sound of rain against the windows. I could practically hear the wheels turning in Sarah and Mark's heads as they tried to figure out how they'd been outmaneuvered. Finally, Sarah turned to me, her face a mixture of shock, anger, and something that might have been respect, asking how I could do this to them. I stood up slowly, and for the first time in months I felt my full height and strength. I asked her how she could do what she did to me. She protested that they were trying to help me, but I told her no, they weren't. They were trying to help themselves. They'd come into my home and told me I was incompetent. They'd made arrangements to warehouse me in a nursing home without asking what I wanted. They'd planned to steal my house and sell it for their own benefit. And they'd done all of this while owing me $40,000 that they'd never even mentioned repaying. Sarah's face went white. She'd forgotten about the money they owed us. Mark said weakly that those were different, that they were family loans. I asked if they were because I didn't remember them ever paying any of it back. I didn't remember them ever even acknowledging that they owed it. But I told them that wasn't even the point. The point was that they'd assumed I was helpless. They'd assumed I had no options. They'd assumed I'd just roll over and let them take everything I'd worked for. Sarah asked in a smaller voice about my money and how I was going to afford to live. The property taxes alone on this house were thousands of dollars a year. I smiled and told her that's where she'd made her biggest mistake. She'd assumed she knew everything about my financial situation. Jim cleared his throat, saying perhaps this would be a good time to mention that I had other assets. When Mark demanded to know what other assets, Jim explained. There was the duplex on Pine Street for starters. It had been generating rental income for about 15 years now. Sarah looked confused, asking what duplex, and Jim explained it was the one Robert had bought as an investment property. It was worth about $400,000 now, and it generated about $4,800 per month in rental income. I watched Mark do the math, realizing that was almost $60,000 a year. Jim confirmed that yes, and I had been saving that income in a separate account. I'd never touched a penny of it. When Sarah asked how much was in the account, though, she looked like she was afraid of the answer. Jim said calmly, $850,000, plus the value of the duplex itself. I had well over $1 million in assets. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah sank into her chair like someone had let all the air out of her. Mark repeated faintly over $1 million, and I confirmed that was right. More than enough to pay for the finest care facility in the state, if I ever decided I wanted to live in one. More than enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life. More than enough to hire home health care if I needed it, or to travel, or to do whatever I wanted to do. Sarah whispered, asking why I didn't tell them, and I explained because they didn't ask. They'd made assumptions about my life, my capabilities, my finances, everything. They'd decided what was best for me without bothering to find out what I actually wanted or needed. Mark was reading through the lease agreement again, probably looking for loopholes, asking if they were stuck paying for a house they couldn't live in and couldn't sell. I told him not forever. The lease expired when I died. Then they could do whatever they wanted with the property. Sarah protested that could be 20 years, and I agreed it could be 30 years. I was in excellent health, you know. Good genes on both sides of the family. And now that I didn't have the stress of worrying about my daughter trying to steal my home, I felt better than I had in years. Jim started packing up his papers, saying he thought everything was settled here. He congratulated Sarah and Mark on their new investment property and told me I had his number if I needed anything. After Jim left, Sarah and Mark sat in my living room, looking like they'd been hit by a truck. The champagne bottle sat unopened on the table, a monument to their premature celebration. Sarah finally said she couldn't believe I'd done this to them, and I replied that I couldn't believe they'd thought they could do what they did to me. Did they really think I just let them steamroll me? She protested that they weren't steamrolling me. They were making difficult decisions that I couldn't make for myself. I asked based on what? When had I ever given them the impression that I was incompetent? When had I ever asked for their help managing my affairs? Sarah was quiet for a moment, then said I was old. People my age, they needed help sometimes. I told her some people my age needed help. I wasn't some people. I was me. I was the woman who'd worked 3 jobs to put her through school. I was the woman who'd managed a household budget so tight it squeaked while still finding money for her dance lessons and college tuition. I was the woman who'd taken care of her father through his illness and managed his medical care and handled all the insurance and paperwork. What about any of that suggested I was incompetent? Mark stood up abruptly, telling Sarah to come on. They should go home and figure out how to deal with this. I told them there was nothing to deal with. They owned my house now, just like they'd wanted. They should enjoy all the responsibilities that came with it. Sarah was almost crying now, saying they couldn't afford this. The taxes and insurance and utilities, it was going to cost them more than they made. I told her calmly that then they shouldn't have been so eager to take on property ownership. This was what it actually cost to own a house, Sarah. These were the expenses I'd been dealing with for 30 years. When she protested that I'd said the rental income from the duplex paid for everything, I explained that the rental income from the duplex went into my savings account. I paid for this house with my Social Security and Robert's pension, just like I'd told them. The difference was, I knew how to live within my means. After they left, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Robert's chair. The house felt peaceful again, like it had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. The next few weeks were educational. Sarah called almost daily, alternating between anger and bargaining. First, she tried to convince me that I was being unreasonable and hurting my own family. Then she tried to guilt me about the financial burden I was placing on her and Mark. Finally, she tried to negotiate. Maybe I could pay more rent, or maybe I could move to a smaller apartment in the house, and they could rent out the rest. During one of these conversations, I told her the lease was very clear. $200 per month for the entire property. That's what Robert and I had agreed to 30 years ago. And that's what stood. She said I should be reasonable, they couldn't afford to subsidize my housing. But I explained they weren't subsidizing anything. They were fulfilling the obligations they'd taken on when they became property owners. If they didn't want those obligations, they shouldn't have been so eager to take the property. When she protested that they didn't know about the lease, I pointed out that they didn't ask about the lease. They were so focused on getting what they wanted that they didn't bother to do their due diligence. The truth was, I could have afforded to pay market rent. With my savings and rental income, I could have afforded to buy a luxury condo if I'd wanted to. But this wasn't about money. It was about respect. It was about Sarah learning that I wasn't a victim to be managed, and that actions have consequences. 2 months after the property transfer, Sarah came by again. She looked tired, and I wondered if the stress of owning a house they couldn't afford was taking its toll. She told me we needed to talk, and I noticed she didn't have that condescending tone anymore. We sat in the living room, and Sarah was quiet for a long moment. She finally said the property taxes were due next month. I said I imagined they were. It was that time of year. She told me $4,000 plus they'd just gotten the insurance renewal, $2,600, and the furnace was making a funny noise. I waited. Sarah was learning valuable lessons about the real costs of property ownership. She said they couldn't afford it. Between the taxes and insurance and utilities, they were spending more on this house than they made on their apartment. I said that sounded like a difficult situation. Then she asked what it would take for me to buy the house back. I raised an eyebrow, asking, buy it back. Sarah, I'd never sold it to her. I'd given it to her, remember? She'd been so grateful. Her face flushed as she said, please. They'd made a mistake. She'd made a mistake. She was sorry. It was the first genuine apology I'd heard from her. I asked what exactly she was sorry for, and Sarah took a deep breath. She said she was sorry for treating me like I couldn't make my own decisions. She was sorry for assuming I was helpless. She was sorry for trying to force me into a nursing home I didn't want. And she was sorry for trying to take my house. I nodded slowly and asked what she would do differently if she could go back. She said she would have asked me what I wanted. She would have listened to my answer, and she would have trusted that I knew what was best for my own life. She was crying now, quiet tears that she kept wiping away. She told me she loved me. She knew she hadn't shown it very well lately, but she did. She was scared. Scared of losing me. Scared of watching me get sick. Scared of not knowing how to help. But that was no excuse for what she'd done. I reached over and took her hand, telling her I loved her too. I always had, even when I was furious with her. When she asked if I'd forgive her, I told her I already had, but forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. She needed to understand that I wasn't a fragile old lady who needed her to make decisions for me. I was her mother and I was still perfectly capable of running my own life. She said she knew that now. She was so sorry it took her this long to see it. We sat quietly for a moment, and then Sarah asked what happened now. I said, well, that depended. Did she still think I should be in a nursing home? She said no, God no. She could see now that I was fine here. I was happy here. This was my home. I asked if she still wanted to own my house, and Sarah actually laughed a sound that was half humor and half exhaustion. She said no, honestly, she'd never wanted the responsibility. She'd thought if they owned it, they could make sure I was taken care of. But she could see now that I was already taking care of myself just fine. I asked what she wanted then, and she thought about it for a moment. She said she wanted her mom back. She wanted to visit because she enjoyed my company, not because she felt guilty. She wanted to stop worrying about me all the time because she trusted me to ask for help if I needed it. And she wanted to stop being my landlord because it was weird and stressful and, frankly, they were terrible at it. I smiled, telling her those all sounded like reasonable goals. When she asked if I'd buy the house back, I said for the right price. She asked what the right price was, and I pretended to consider it. I said, well, she'd only owned it for 2 months, and she hadn't made any improvements. In fact, she'd been a significant financial burden to the property, what with all the taxes and insurance she owed. I'd say $1. Sarah stared at me, asking $1, and I said plus she had to promise to visit me regularly because she wanted to, not because she felt obligated. And she had to stop treating me like I was incompetent. She started to say something, but I continued, and she had to acknowledge that I knew what was best for my own life. If I ever did need care, we'd discuss the options together, and I'd make the final decision. She promised all of that. I told her there was one more thing, and when she asked what I said that $40,000 she and Mark owed me, I wasn't asking them to pay it back, but I wanted them to acknowledge that it existed. I wanted them to remember that Robert and I had sacrificed a lot to help them get started in life. Sarah's face crumpled as she said, oh, Mom, I'm so sorry. She didn't think about it that way. I told her I knew she didn't. That was part of the problem. She'd gotten so used to taking from us that she'd forgotten it was taking. I went to my desk and pulled out a document Jim had prepared weeks earlier, a quitclaim deed transferring the property back to me for $1. I told her to sign here, handing her a pen. Sarah read through the document quickly and signed without hesitation, saying there. Now we were back where we started. I said not quite where we started. Hopefully we were both a little wiser now. Sarah was crying again, but these were different tears. She told me again how sorry she was for all of it. I said I knew and I forgave her. But Sarah, I added, and when she looked up I continued, if you ever try to manipulate me like that again, I'll donate everything I own to charity and leave you a bill for my funeral expenses. She laughed, despite her tears, saying deal. That evening, after Sarah left, I called Jim to let him know the house was back in my name. He chuckled when I told him about the $1 sale price, saying that in all his years practicing law, he'd never seen anyone teach their child a lesson quite so effectively. I told him I'd had a good teacher thinking of Robert. My husband always said that sometimes you have to let people make their own mistakes, but you don't have to make it easy for them. Jim said he sounded like a wise man, and I agreed. He was, and he was right about something else too. I was stronger than I knew. 6 months later, Sarah and I had settled into a new routine. She visited every Sunday, and we cooked dinner together. Sometimes Mark came too, and we all got along much better now that nobody was trying to control anybody else's life. I never did go to Sunset Manor, obviously. I visited it once just out of curiosity, and it was actually quite nice. But it wasn't home. It wasn't where I belonged. I also started dating. Harold Morrison, Jim's brother, as it turned out, was a retired English professor who lived a few blocks away. He'd lost his wife about the same time I'd lost Robert, and we'd met at the library one day when we both reached for the same book. He was smart and funny and kind, and he treated me like a competent adult woman, not a fragile elderly person who needed managing. Sarah was initially skeptical about Harold, but when she met him and saw how happy he made me, she gave him her blessing. She told me he was good for me. I laughed more when he was around. My duplex tenants moved out at the end of their lease, and I decided to sell the property rather than deal with finding new renters. The sale netted me another $400,000, bringing my total assets to well over $1 million. I was by any reasonable standard wealthy. I used some of the money to make improvements to my house. New windows, an updated kitchen, a beautiful garden room where I could sit and read in the morning sun. I also set up a trust fund for any future grandchildren Sarah might give me, and I made substantial donations to several charities I cared about. The rest I kept as my security blanket, not because I was afraid of being poor, but because I wanted to make sure I'd never be at anyone's mercy again. I wanted to know that I could afford whatever care I might need, whatever accommodations I might want, whatever independence I might require. 1 year after the great property transfer debacle, as Harold called it, Sarah came to visit on a Sunday that wasn't our regular dinner day. She had news. She told me she was pregnant. I felt my heart skip with joy telling her that was wonderful news. She said they'd found out yesterday. She was about 8 weeks along. I hugged her tightly, thinking about how different this conversation was from the one we'd had about nursing homes. This time, Sarah was sharing good news because she wanted to, not because she was trying to manipulate me into something. I asked how she was feeling, and she said excited, scared, happy, all of it. Then she paused and said she was hoping would I be willing to help with the baby. Not financially, she added quickly. She knew I'd already done enough of that, but just be a grandmother. Help her figure out how to be a mother. I told her I would be honored to help, and not just with advice, with whatever she needed. Babysitting, middle-of-the-night phone calls, emergency diaper runs, all of it. When she asked really, I said of course, but I had one condition. Sarah looked worried, asking what, and I told her she had to promise me that if she thought I was doing something wrong, or if she disagreed with my advice, she'd tell me directly. No more assuming I was too old or too set in my ways to handle honesty. She promised. I also told her she had to promise that she'd make her own decisions about how to raise her child. I was here to help and support, not to take over. She said that was exactly what she wanted. 9 months later, I held my granddaughter Emma for the first time. She was perfect, tiny, and red-faced, and absolutely beautiful. Sarah had done beautifully during labor, and Mark had managed not to faint, which I considered a victory. I whispered that she was perfect, cradling Emma in my arms. Sarah said she looked like I did when I was born. She'd found some old photos last week. I looked down at Emma's tiny face and felt a love so fierce it took my breath away. This was why I'd fought so hard to maintain my independence, not just for my own sake, but so I could be here for moments like this. So I could be the grandmother Emma deserved, not some diminished version of myself, warehoused in an institution. I thanked Sarah, and when she asked for what, I told her for giving me the chance to be Emma's grandmother, for learning to see me as a person instead of a problem, for growing up into someone I was proud to call my daughter. Sarah was crying again, happy tears this time. She thanked me for not giving up on her, for teaching her that love didn't mean control. That night, Harold and I sat on my back porch watching the sunset and talking about the future. Emma was sleeping peacefully in her crib at Sarah's house, and all was right with the world. Harold told me I'd done good with Sarah with the house situation, with all of it. I said I'd had help thinking of Robert. My husband always told me I was stronger than I knew. It just took me a while to believe him. Harold asked what I thought Robert would say about all this, and I smiled, saying I thought he'd say it was about time I stood up for myself. And I thought he'd be proud that I finally learned the difference between being loving and being a doormat. Harold squeezed my hand, asking what was next for me. I looked around my garden at the house I'd fought to keep, at the life I'd built and defended and reclaimed. I told him more of this. More Sunday dinners with Sarah. More time with Emma. More mornings in my garden and evenings on this porch. More of feeling like myself instead of like someone's burden. Harold said it sounded perfect, and I agreed. It was perfect. Not because it was easy, but because it was mine. Because I'd chosen it, and because I'd fought for it, and because I'd proved to myself that I was still the woman who could fight for what mattered. 3 years later, I'm 81 years old and busier than I've been in years. Emma is walking and talking and bringing chaos and joy into my life on a regular basis. Sarah is pregnant again, a boy this time, and she's already asking me to help plan the nursery. Harold and I got married last spring, a simple ceremony in my back garden, with just family and close friends. Sarah walked me down the aisle, and Emma was our flower girl. It was perfect. I still live in my house on Maple Street, the house I fought to keep the house, that's now filled with laughter and visits and the sounds of children playing. Harold moved in after our wedding, and we've turned his old house into a rental property. We're quite the real estate moguls now, apparently. Sometimes people ask me if I regret being so harsh with Sarah during the property transfer situation. The answer is still no. I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret doing it. Sarah needed to learn that I wasn't someone she could manipulate and control, and I needed to prove to myself that I still had fight left in me. More importantly, we both needed to learn that love doesn't mean ownership. Love doesn't mean making decisions for other people for their own good. Love means respecting people enough to let them make their own choices, even when you disagree with those choices. The nursing home deposit was never refunded, by the way. Sarah and Mark lost that money completely, which I considered a fair price for the lesson they learned. They never complained about it. And Sarah even mentioned once that losing the money was worth it to gain a better relationship with me. I keep my financial statements in a safe in my bedroom now, not because I'm secretive, but because I want to remember what it feels like to have choices. I want to remember that I'm not dependent on anyone's goodwill or charity. If I ever do need care, it will be care I choose in a place I select on terms I approve. For now, though, I'm exactly where I want to be, in my own home with my own life, surrounded by people who love me for who I am, rather than what I can provide. I'm 81 years old, and I've never been happier or more at peace. Sometimes strength isn't about what you can lift or how fast you can run. Sometimes strength is about knowing your own worth and refusing to let anyone diminish it. Sometimes strength is about teaching the people you love that you won't be taken advantage of, even by them, especially by them. I kept my promise to Robert. I didn't let anyone take advantage of me. And in the end, that's what saved not just my house and my independence, but my relationship with my daughter and my ability to be the grandmother Emma and her future brother deserve. The best revenge, it turns out, isn't revenge at all. It's living well on your own terms with your dignity intact. It's refusing to be a victim, even when the people trying to victimize you are the ones you love most. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the people you love learn to love you back in a way that honors who you really are, instead of who they think you should be. That's the ending I fought for. That's the ending I won.